This is our ongoing discussion of Simondon's individuation in light of notions of form and information. We're starting from page 241 of the translation in part 2 of the book on vital individuation, and within that part it's chapter 2, section 2, subsection 4. I always forget to check that before we start. But so last time we saw discussion of the stages of life, I guess is the way to put it. So the relationship between youth and maturity and old age as different stages of life. And Simondon argues that maturity, or the stage of maturity, is the most sort of representative of what an individual is. So it's at the stage of maturity that the individual is the most of what they are, I guess we could say, rather than, so in the way that a lifespan is spreading out of the individual over time, it's the midpoint of that spread of that series that serves as the more fundamental, or the most real point of that series. So yeah, the notion of maturity is the key one there. And we also saw, just before that discussion of maturity, the two different notions of death, or the two different aspects of death that Simondon distinguishes. So on the one hand, there's this sort of external character of death, or external nature of death. So insofar as an individual is undergoing processes of individuation in response to something in its environment, so the environment poses a problem of some kind, and the individual undergoes a process of individuation as a resolution of that problem. But there's always, to some extent, or there's always the possibility of a failure to solve the problem, or an incomplete solution of the problem. So the environment continues to pose problems, and then eventually the organism is not capable of solving those problems. And so this is an external notion of death. Then in contrast to this, we have the internal notion of death, or the internal aspect of death, which has to do with the way the individuation process has a certain remainder to it, or a certain entropy. It uses up the potentials of the individuating organism. He points to the way that tissues kept in a petri dish, or in a lab setting, or whatever, as long as you prevent them from growing into a mass of too big of a mass, so that it starts differentiating. So as long as you keep it in a small enough size that it doesn't differentiate, then it will live on indefinitely. So it's only once it undergoes differentiation into different forms of tissue and different organs and so on that it has a determinate lifespan. And so Simondon points to this as evidence that there's a certain sort of correspondence between individuation and using up of potentials. And so this would be an internal notion of death, because it's a death that comes just from the process of individuation itself, rather than from something that the environment does to the organism, or a problem that the environment poses to the organism. So that's what we saw last time, those two notions of death, and then the account of maturity as being the highest degree of existence of the individual. And then the last line here that we saw was about Lucretius's metaphor or image of the generations of living beings who pass a torch from one to another in a relay race. So one generation carries the torch for a while, and then passes it on to the next one, who carries it and passes it on in turn. So Simondon is going to look now at the relationship between individuation and the collective. So the way that the individual fits into a collective, and what that means for individuation. So that's what we're going to see today. Okay, so I'll start reading from the top of 241. I think this is another one of these multi-page paragraphs. So I'll read about a page or so, and then we can stop to discuss. For species in which complete and distinct individuals do not exist, this inactuality of young and old never forms to the same extent. The colony or vital ensemble circulates a perpetual actuality in the different parts of the being. In superior species, accentuated ontogenesis and its correlate in old age phase shifts the individual from one end to the other with respect to this actuality of the collective. The individuated being is not in phase with life, properly speaking, except in its maturity. And this is precisely the resolution of the problem that only the individuation of separate beings can achieve. The colony is fixed in its perpetual actuality. It cannot detach itself or phase shift from end to end relative to its present. It can only react and develop according to continuity. Life, which comes up with ontogenesis and aging through the invention of the separated individual, creates this end-to-end phase shift of each individuated being relative to the collective and to the actual. The mode of being of the collective of individuals differs from the perpetual present of the colonies of primitive living beings, due to the fact that it is the encounter of individual becomings in a present that dominates the advance of youth and the delay of old age and incorporates them into a real entelechy. The collective finds and realizes the signification of these two temporal decenterings that constitute the forward phase shift of growth and the backward phase shift of aging. The collective, the functional equivalent of the colony, is the signification of the two inverse and contradictory aspects of ontogenesis and destruction, which are incompatible in the individual. The individual finds the signification of perceptive disparations through action. By way of this superior analog of action that is presence, the collective finds in the individual signification of disparation the pair of anabolic processes and catabolic processes, of ontogenesis and degradation, a pairing of the ascent toward existence and the descent toward the definitive stability of the equilibrium of death. The definitive and only metastability is that of the collective, since it is perpetuated without aging throughout successive individuations. Inferior species may not involve separate individuality. Metastability can be immanent to the individual, or instead it can traverse the whole imperfectly portioned into individuals. In superior species, the permanence of life is also found at the level of the collective, but it is found there at a superior level. It is rediscovered there as signification, as the dimension within which the ascent and degradation of the individuated being is integrated. The collective is born by the maturity of individuals, a maturity that is the superior dimension relative to which youth and old age are organized, and that is not a transitional state between youth and old age. The individual is mature to the extent that it is integrated into the collective, i.e. to the extent that it is simultaneously old and young, prior to and coming after relative to the present, thereby containing within itself both future potentials and traces of the past. Okay, let's stop there to discuss this bit, if I can just scroll up. Here he's contrasting what he calls as superior organisms, so the organisms that have a high degree of individuality, and the inferior organisms that have a low degree of individuality that exist in this colony form, or this unindividuated form in something like a colony. And we've seen this distinction before in the rest of this part of the book. But here the relationship of the individual is treated, so in the superior species, the ones that have a high degree of individuation, he's talking about how those individuals are still integrated into something that is larger or greater than the individual. So in this case, it's not a colony, but a collective, a group in which the members are all individuals, unlike a colony. Here, the collective, it has this role of a sort of eternal present, in the way that in one particular individual, they have a past and a future. They have juvenile stage and maturity, and then old age. But the colony is always the same. Age. It's composed of individuals at different stages of their lifespan, and the collective. The collective is composed of individuals at different stages of their lifespan. And so the collective is always present in that sense. It's always in the sort of middle phase rather than being in the juvenile phase or this phase of old age. Right. Okay. So that bit was not too difficult, I think. So we can go on to the next page or so if someone else would like to read from 242. The individual finds its meaning in this phase shift via which it offers the bidimensionality of time, coming to be then passing away, swelling with potentials toward the future, then being insularly structured in the past, to the integration of the collective. With the present, the collective is the resolution of the incompatible bidimensionality within the individual in accordance with the tridimensionality that coheres in the present. This is because there is a great difference between the future and the past as they are for the separate individual, and the future and the past as they are in the three-dimensional system of collective presence. The future and the past become dimensions through the presence of the present. Before the individuation of the collective, the future is the isolated signification of Embolic processes, and the past is the isolated signification of Catabolic processes. These two processes do not coincide. Relative to one another, they are disparate and yet paired together, for each action implies both the one and the other. In the collective, individual action takes on a meaning because it is present. The present of the collective is comparable to the third dimension of space for perception. The future and the past of the individual find a coincidence in this dimension and are organized there into a system due to an axiomatic of a superior degree. The individual bears within it the conditions of temporal depth, but not this dimension of depth. Alone, it would be held within its future and its past, which means that it would not be fully living. For any vital signification to be found, the temporal duality of the individual must be organized according to the tridimensionality of the collective. In the collective, the pairing of the future and the past becomes signification, for the individuated being is recognized as integrated. It is integrated not only according to its past or to its future or its past, but according to the direction of the condensation of its future and its past. The individual is present in the collective, it is unified in the present through its action. The collective is not a substance or a form anterior to the individuated beings that would compel them, penetrate them, or condition them. The collective is the communication that envelops and resolves individual disparitions as a presence that is the synergy of actions, and the coincidence of futures and pasts as an internal resonance of the collective. Indeed, collective synergy supposes a unity that creates a domain of transductivity from which it is not yet individuated within each individual being, something which could be called the charge of nature associated with the individuated being. The collective is that in which an individual action has a meaning for other individuals as a symbol. Each action presented to the others is a symbol of the others. It belongs to a reality that individuates into totality, as capable of accounting for the simultaneous and successive plurality of actions. So maybe the first point to, the first point to clarify here is these terms embolic and catabolic that he uses throughout this passage. So these have to do with metabolic processes in organism. So anabolic refers to the processes that build up structures so you're taking in nutrition from food or from the environment in general and building up structures from them. And then catabolic processes are the converse processes that take a structure in an organism, like say fat cells, and break them down into energy that is used by other processes in the organism. So that's one point. So the metabolism is divided up into these anabolic and catabolic processes. So they're sort of coordinate to each other. They each one is the opposite side of the other. And then, to answer your question, Angus, so the question is about Simondon's use of the term symbol here towards the end of the paragraph that I just read. Here, I think, yes, it is being used in relation to the symbolon, the ancient Greek token that's broken in half. I think whenever Simondon uses the term symbol, that's always, or almost always, what he has in mind. So for those who maybe weren't there for that discussion or don't remember that part, Simondon talks about this ancient Greek practice of taking a stone or some sort of token and breaking it in half, and then using each of those halves as a way of recognizing the other one. And so when someone was a guest of a host, they would create this symbolon, this token that's broken in half, and that token would be passed on to the descendants of the guest and the host, so that they could recognize each other in the future as well. And so when Simondo talks about a symbol, I think he always has this example in mind. And so a symbol has to do with some aspect of reality that fits in together with another aspect of reality. There's this notion of fitting together, or two coordinate halves or two sides of some entity that are coordinate to each other, I think is always at work when he talks about symbols. So to go back up a little bit, so he talks about the dimensionality of time, and he talks about two different sort of systems of dimensionality to time. So for the individual, time has these two dimensions. It has coming to be and passing away. So this the one dimension in which the individual comes to have potentials. So this is like the maturation side of a lifespan, I guess we can say. And then the other dimension is the using up of those potentials, and this is the aging side of the lifespan. And so these two dimensions or two aspects of time overlap to some extent, of course. Like certain properties of an individual might be already might reach their peak at one stage of a lifespan, and then others would reach their peak later on in the individual's lifespan, so that the aging side would have already begun for certain properties, whereas other properties are still on the maturation side. So there's a certain overlap between these two dimensions or aspects of time for the living individual. But then at the level of the collective, he talks about not a bidimensionality, but a tridimensionality. So there's three dimensions of time at the level of the collective, and the third dimension, or what makes it three dimensions rather than two, is the presence of the present. So the presence of the present here means that the collective, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, the collective is always the same age, or there's a certain community, I guess, between individuals of different ages in the collective, so that the collective itself contains both young and old, and then also mature individuals. And so the collective is always the same age. It doesn't age. It doesn't age and doesn't come to maturity in the way that an individual does. And so because of this, the collective has this three-dimensional. The temporal structure of the collective has a three-dimensional structure rather than the two-dimensional one that's characteristic of the individual. And then maybe the last point here is that the collective has to do always with something in the individual which is not individuated. And so we've seen this a few different occasions or a few different points of this book, where individuation is always on the basis of something pre-individual, and there's always something of that pre-individual that remains in the process of individuation. So the individual that results from the process of individuation is only part of the results of that process. There's always something of the pre-individual that remains, and which is subject to further processes of individuation. And so the collective has to do with not just a sort of abstract grouping of individuated beings insofar as they are already individuated. It has to do with a secondary individuation of beings that are not fully individuated already. So the collective is another stage of individuation or another individuation process after the first one that brings about the individuals in the first place. So whenever we see collective, we should always think of individuation process and not just a grouping of individuals that are already individuated. Everyone's quiet today. Yeah, so we can go on to the next bit if someone else would like to read from The Collective Is Not.
The collective is not merely the reciprocity of actions. Within each action is a signification. Insofar as each action resolves the problem of separate individuals and is constituted as a symbol of other actions, the synergy of actions is not merely a de facto synergy, an interdependence that ends in a result. It is due to the fact that it is structured as symbolic of the others, that each action is just a capacity of making the individual past coincide with the individual present. In order for the dimension of presence to exist, it requires not only several individuals gathered together, it also requires this union to be inscribed in their own dimensionality, and requires that within them, present and future be correlative of the dimensions of other beings through this unity of the present. The present is that in which there is signification, through which a certain resonance of the past toward the future and the future toward the past is created. The exchange of information from one being to another passes through the present. Each being becomes reciprocal with respect to itself to the extent what it becomes reciprocal with respect to the others. Intra-individual integration is reciprocal with trans-individual integration. The category of presence is also the category of trans-individual. A structure and a function exist both in individuals and from one individual to another, without them being able to define as merely external or internal. This relation between individuals through individuals expresses the fact that individuals are amplified in a vast reality via the intermediary of something that is problematic tension within them. Example, information. This reality can be called the pre-individual charge within the individual. Action, the resolution of perspective polarities into dynamic unity, implies intervention of this pre-individual reality. The being called a pure individuated being has nothing within it to go beyond perceptive words in their plurality. The individual being would remain compatible with itself if it had nothing but perception, and it would have nothing but perception if there were nothing available to resolve these problems. Then what the being is, qua individuated individual, as a result of anterior operation of individuation, the being must be able to appeal in it, now study it to a not yet individuated reality. This reality is the information that it contains relative to pre-individual real. This charge is the very principle of the trans-individual. It communicates directly with the other pre-individual realities contained in other individuals, just as the links of network communicate with one another by each link being surpassed in the following link. Participating in an active reality within which it is nothing but a link, the individuated being acts in the collective. Action is this networked exchange between the individuals of a collective, an exchange that creates the internal resonance of the system formed in this way. The group can be considered as a substance with respect to the individual, but only in an exact fashion. Indeed, the group is reached starting from the charge of individual reality of each of the group's individuals. The group does not directly incorporate individuals, but the charge of pre-individual reality. Here through the latter, but not as the individuated individuals, that beings are included in the trans-individual relation. The trans-individual is that which in non-provisional individuals is equivalent to the transformation of provisional beings used for genetic transfer into colonies or to the seed's development into a plant.
Right, so we have here more discussion of the symbolic nature of actions. So the way that each action serves as a symbol for the others, in the sense that we talked about a little bit earlier, where an action has this character of pointing towards another action, or of being coordinate with another action, in the same way that the two halves of the token sort of point towards each other. Right. This notion of resonance is one that we saw in the first part of the book as well, in the part on physical individuation. Here, this is a little bit different. So in the first part of the book, it was talking about the physical notion of resonance, so that it had to do with the way that different parts of a physical system were connected to each other, and how the oscillations of one portion of the system are coordinated with those of another. But here he's talking about the resonance of the past and the future toward each other. So this is a different notion of resonance, or at least a sort of expanded version of the resonance that we were talking about in the case of physical individuation. So I think the way that it should be understood here is that the past and the future as dimensions of the collective. The collective as containing both youth and old age, or as containing the maturation side of the lifespan, and also the aging side of the lifespan. Those two sides are connected to each other, so that it's not just that there's sort of one aspect of reality, one aspect of the temporal lifespan of a collective, and then also another aspect as just something additional added on, but rather each aspect of the lifespan is sort of symbolic of the other, or is related to the other in the same way as the two halves of a token are related to each other. And so there's this resonance in the broader sense here means something like an internal relation between one aspect of reality and another, and so we have a resonance between the past and the future in the collective, and likewise a resonance from the future toward the past. So each of them is connected to the other.
I'm finally back, so I can read the next section. But I wanted to ask if Simondon is still he's referring to the collective here, or his idea of the collective here is still being used in the limited sense in which he used it earlier in the book, as opposed to the societal and the interindividual, because it seems like, I guess the idea that the present only exists in the collective, and this idea that the collective is kind of the equivalent of the colony for more individuated life forms. And it seems that some kind of equivalent of the colony and also the ability to have like a present seem like things that every individual would need. But my understanding of the collective was that it was something that is rarer than the interindividual and societal.
Yes, I think so. To the first part of the question is whether he's using his notion of the collective in the limited sense in which he used it in earlier passages, when he contrasts the collective with the social and the interindividual. And I think the answer is yes. I think he is using it in that specific sense, because he, in that earlier passage, when he's explaining what he means by the collective in his specific sense of the term, he talks about a trans individual, or the process of collective individuation as the formation of something like a trans individual, which has to do with what remains of the pre-individual in each of the individuals that form the collective, and then they undergo a further process of individuation. And so that same account of the collective reappears in this passage as well. So I think he is using the same notion of the collective as he was in the previous passage. But that does raise the question, the second part of your question, having to do with whether there's something like the present for an organism or an individual outside of a collective, and if not, then what are we to make of this notion from the earlier passage that the collective is something rare, and rather than something like the general condition of an individuated being? And I think that's a good question. I'm not sure that I have a good answer to it, but I think when he talks about a present here, this has to do not just with or I guess how I would put it is he's talking about the present here as a dimension of time rather than as a one moment of time in which time would appear as a dimension itself. So in a sort of standard physical representation of time, time appears as one dimension alongside the three dimensions of space, or the multiple dimensions of a state space. But and then so the present would just be one moment in the temporal series. But here, when he talks about the present, it's not the present as a moment of the dimension which time would constitute as a whole, but rather the present or the presence of the present as a dimension of time. So this notion of a dimension of time, or of time having multiple dimensions, I think has to do with the way that there are these different processes ongoing within an individual, so that there's the process of maturation and the process of aging can be ongoing at the same time in an individual. There's a certain overlap between the two, but they're still distinct elements or aspects of the structure of time for that individual. And likewise, I think the present, when he talks about it in this passage, is a dimension of time, which has to do with the communication between individuals. So it's only in the collective that there is something like a present in the sense of this resonance between past and future, or this communicability between the process of aging and the process of maturation. So the individual, distinct from the collective, or the individual, insofar as it is not part of a collective, would still have some sort of relation to the present as a moment of time, but would not have this relationship to the present as a dimension of the temporal structure of an individual. So I think that's how I would try to make sense of that distinction between between the moment, the present as a moment of time, and the present as a dimension of time, or a dimension of temporal structure. I think that's how we can sort of make sense of how the collective is something that is rare, and also has this important connection to the present.
Maybe my question is like in relation to the this question as well, but maybe not like I think the part we just have read key was the resonance, kind of a colony, and yeah, I think so. Because like, and then, again, like a question about like the identity of information comes again. I mean, comes up again. I don't know exactly what Simondong is like trying to say through the concept information. Sometimes it's like information as we know, like the kind of a common sense of information, but sometimes, as he explained in the previous part, it's like a kind of a structure or frame, or which is like a flexible, transformative, something like that. So regarding like the concept of colony, a collective identity of this all kind of transformation of, I am thinking like, what is Simondong's like the big picture of this whole idea? So each individual has individuality. Like it sounds like the mixture of the past and the future as something a little bit hidden under the surface, but the present is like comes up as an action, and then which is like shows you what's in the individual, like in the mixture of like a present, past, and the future, and then something comes up on the surfaces as actually the present. I think it's kind of like a too much, but maybe like we can think of other kind of like a thinkers ideas. For example, if you think of like a logical sense and then delusion, and then I'm not sure it can be connected to the idea, but phantasm and then simulacrum. If you think of those kind of concepts, maybe each individual's phantasm as simulated manifest expressions of something, like as a kind of actions on the surface, could make a resonance to other individuals at the end of the day, like to make something new as a kind of genesis. So Simondong think there is something being, collective being out there, which constitutes of, which it has its individual as an element. The identity, the nature of a colony. So how many colonies in the world? There only one, or according to the geographic difference or time difference, there are more than one colony, or Simondong supposes, there could be one big massive like colony, like collective thing of whole individuals, and all individuals. So to some a first idea is, I'm not sure the meaning of, the concept of information. Second, I'm wondering, like, I can get the key points of this part is like resonance, a collective, and then he's trying to say about like pre-individuality as a potential of genesis, like the in the process of like a individuation. Kind of for me, like it's kind of mixture of like the present and then the past and the future, and then it comes up as an action in the present. So I'm wondering, like, my understanding makes sense, and then also it's kind of like it sounds a little silly, but the identity of a colony, it could be more than one, or it doesn't matter the number of colony in human history, whatever, something like that. Thank you.
Right. Maybe the first thing I would say is that we need to distinguish between colonies and collectives. So a colony has to do with these types of organisms that have a low degree of individuation. So like we saw in the last chapter, I think it was, when he talks about sponges, for example, that they grow together and they share a circulatory system, and the only really individual aspect of them is the fact that they are born and die independently of each other, but pretty much everything else is shared, and so the colony is almost a sort of quasi-organism on its own, of which the individual sponges would be members, rather than the sponges themselves forming distinct individuals. So that's a colony. So a colony always has to do with organisms that are not individuals, or that have a low degree of individuality, whereas a collective is a grouping of individuals with a high degree of individuality, and I think he's thinking primarily of human collectives. I don't know to what extent he would describe animal societies as having collectives, but so a collective is a grouping of individuals with a high degree of individuality that undergoes a further process of individuation at the collective level. So something within them that is not individuated at the level of the individual undergoes a further process of individuation at the level of the collective. So that distinction is an important one between the colony and the collective. But then, your question about how many colonies or how many collectives there are, I think the way Simondon would put it is that collectives are somewhat transitory, in the sense that they don't always exist. So it's not like the whole of human history would be one giant collective or something like that. Collectives are formed, and they persist for a certain amount of time, and then they dissolve, I guess, when the individuals that make them up no longer are individuated together in the form of a collective. So say if like the Roman Empire was a collective, or had a collective aspect to it, it was formed at a certain time and it lasted for a certain time, and then after a while it eventually dissolves and breaks up into various successor states. So any collective is always transitory, in the sense that it only lasts for a certain amount of time, and it's always subject to being broken up or to dissolution, I guess, after a certain amount of time. So I think in light of that, I think we'd have to say that there are lots of collectives that can appear and sort of take their place on the scene for a while, and then disappear after a while. And then your other question about information, I think Angus is right that we're going to see more about this notion of information in the next section, which, or a subsection, I should say. The title is From Information to Signification. So we're going to see more about the notion of information in that section. So I think we should probably wait until we read that bit before we talk about that notion of information. Okay.
like
Oh.
so sorry. One more thing. Like simply, Angus and you seem to have like the same opinion about the colony. Yeah, I agree with that. Like the colony should be differentiated from the idea of the collectives, definitely. But in a way, it sounds like more anthropocentric. Like if you like differentiate by saying like high degree and low degree, things like that. And secondly, regarding colony, like listening to you, yeah, in a way, I'm thinking like there could be like a multiple colonies. But at the same time, if you look at if you see this kind of thing like with the bird eye view, those kind of things as a memory of the past and then like a perspective view of the future, all together can get together and then make a big kind of collective. As you said, like according to time, like Roman Empire, Greek, time era, the whole thing can be said as like one colony, but that those kind of things all together make a one big. Because like everything is accumulated as a kind of memory in human being, like whether that is a conscious or unconscious, it doesn't matter, because through history it's passed down to the other generation. It's any kind of like a form, a cultural form, whatever. It's like just like a pop thing. This kind of thinking was just popped up.
Yeah, this idea of a like a one singular collective that would contain the whole of human history or something like that. I think Simondon would be opposed to using the notion of collective for the whole of human history, or at least what he would say is that the extent to which there is something like a collective at the scale of the whole of human history is very low. So it's true that there is something of culture that is passed on from one generation to the next that persists. But the actual institutions that make up the collective of, say, the Roman Empire, those institutions no longer exist now. They've been replaced by other institutions, and so the collective that existed at that time no longer exists. So maybe we could say that there's a very low degree of individuation at which we can talk about the whole history of humanity as one collective. But in the more specific sense, you would have multiple collectives at much higher degrees of individuation that appear and disappear throughout human history. And then the other point was about how this notion of inferior and superior species as being an anthropocentric one, and I think that's correct. I think biologists who are being careful no longer describe particular species as being more as being superior or inferior, or like more evolved or more perfected than others, or something like that, because all living species are contemporary with each other. Like they're all the results of whatever 3 billion years of evolution that ended up with all the species that exist today, and there's no sort of objective sense in which one species can be said to be more evolved than another, except along one specific evolutionary lineage. So there's no way that you can say something like, humans are more evolved than termites, or I don't know, hummingbirds, or whatever other species you want to take. They're just different species that are that exist contemporaneously with each other, and so they're all equally evolved, and there's no real sense in which you can say that one is superior to another. But the sort of more objective content of what Simondon was talking about when he talks about inferior and superior species is the degree of individuation. So when he talks about superior species, he's talking about species that have a high degree of individuation. And so humans, of course, would be one example, but mammals in general and birds and I guess vertebrates as a whole tend to have high degree of individuation, and then other species would have lower degrees of individuation. So things like sponges and corals and so on that might share circulatory systems and reproduce through budding and all the other things that we've seen in previous sections. So whenever we see inferior and superior organisms in this book, we can always sort of read in the idea of low degree of individuation or high degree of individuation. And I think that's the objective content of what he's talking about, without the sort of evaluation side that is implied when we talk about inferior and superior. Right. So we can go on to subsection 4 now. If someone else would like to read from the beginning of subsection 4.
Okay, from information to signification. It could then be questioned how we should represent the function of individuation when it develops in the living being. It would be necessary to be able to define a notion that would be valid for thinking individuation in physical nature as well as in living nature, and afterwards for defining the internal differentiation of the living being that extends its individuation by separating vital functions into physiological and psychical functions. However, if we take up again the paradigm of technological form taking, we find a notion that seems to be able to pass from one order of reality to another due to its purely operative nature, which is not linked to any particular matter and is only defined relative to an energetic and structural regime, the notion of information. Form, for example, the rectangular parallelepiped, does not act on matter directly. It does not even act after being materialized as the parallelepipedic mold. The mold only intervenes as a modulator of the energy that bears the clay in a particular way at a particular point. The mold is the bearer of information signals. The form must be translated into information signals to be able to effectively encounter the matter when it is originally external to the latter. Individuation is a modulation, yet the notion of information is delivered separately by certain technologies, known as information technologies, on whose basis information theory has been built. But it is difficult to extract a univocal notion of information from these multiple technologies in which the notion of information is utilized and which have led to the usage of quantities. Indeed, the notion of information appears in two almost contradictory ways. In the first case, information, as Norbert Wiener says, is what is opposed to the degradation of energy or the increase of entropy in the system. It is essentially negentropic. In a system in which all possible transformations would have been effectuated, in which all potentials would be actualized, no other transformation would be possible. Nothing would be distinguished from anything else. Thus, in the transmission of a message, information is what is opposed to the general flattening of energy modulated by the signal. It is what guarantees that it is possible to distinguish in a Morse code transmission between the moment when the current passes and the moment when the current does not pass. If during the course of the system's electrical inertia of transmission, self-inductance, the current is established very slowly and diminishes very slowly, it becomes impossible to discern whether the current passes or not, or whether we are dealing with a dash, a dot, or an interval between a dot and a dash. The information signal is the decision between two possible states, for example, current or non-current in the aforementioned case. To transmit a message in Morse code clearly, one must manipulate slowly enough at the start so that, despite the inertia of the apparatus, the signals are still distinct to the receiver, i.e., so that one can clearly distinguish the moments of the current passing and the moments without a current, the indecisive periods of establishment and rupture remaining brief relative to the total duration of a sign or an interval between signs. The information signal provides the decision among possibilities in this first case. It supposes a possible variety of states, non-confusion and distinction. It is opposed in particular to background noise, i.e. what occurs randomly, like the thermal agitation of molecules, when the energetic medium of the signal is essentially discontinuous. When the energetic medium of the signal is essentially discontinuous, like an electrical current consisting of elementary charges in transit, each element of the signal must modulate a large number of elementary units of carried energy in order for the message to be transmitted correctly. An electronic tube of small dimensions has a higher background noise than one with large dimensions, since it allows less electrons to pass per unit of time. In order not to be inconvenient, this quantum discontinuity, due to the type of carried energy in use, must remain extremely inferior to the significative variations that have a meaning for the transmission of information. The information signal is therefore the capacity to decide, and the quantity of information that can be transmitted or registered by a system is proportionate to the number of significative decisions that this system can transmit or register. In this sense, a fine-grained photographic emulsion has a power of resolution greater than that of a coarse-grained emulsion. For the same unreeling speed of the recording head and playback head, a fine-grained magnetic strip can register the sound more faithfully by producing the high-pitched sounds and the harmonics of the low-pitched sounds, which is analogous to fine details for photography. So it sounds like what he's describing here is the notion of the information signal seen from the point of view of transmission, which he'll contrast with reception.
Right. Yeah. So he's talking here about what the transmitter needs, what properties the transmitter needs to have in order for something like information transmission to be possible. And so the general property that the transmitter has to have is that it has to have a variation in possible states that is greater than the variations that are to be transmitted, right? So in the case of the Morse code, if the signal is being transmitted by the voltage the current in the circuit, then the moments when the current is passing and the moments when it's not passing have to be sharply distinguished from each other, or they have to be greater than the degree of difference that is being transmitted. So it has to be possible to on the other side of the circuit for the receiver to determine whether a signal, whether the current is passing or not, rather than being in some intermediate state that is hard to tell whether it's whether the current is passing or not. And so the speed of transmission of the Morse code is limited by the speed with which the current can be turned on and off. And so there's a certain amount of transition time from the no current to the current passing state. And so that transition time has to be much shorter than the time of a dot in the Morse code in order for that dot to be clearly receivable on the other end. And so this notion of information from the side of the transmitter has to do with what is not predictable. So it has to do with this negentropy, or this negative form of entropy, or the negative side of entropy, I guess you could say. So if entropy means what is the most predictable state of a system, then a system in that state, in the state of highest entropy, would not be able to transmit any information because it has no more potentials to be actualized. So this is the first notion of information, and this one provides for the possibility of measuring a quantity of information to be transmitted in the sense that you have a higher degree of variability that allows for transmission. So a system that has only two possible states can only transmit one bit of information at a time, or it can only transmit off or on, or heads or tails, or something like that. Whereas a system with many different possible states, so like a record or a tape recording, is capable of registering many different possible signals at the same time. It has a much higher degree of information transmission per second, or per unit of time, because it has many more possible states it could be in, rather than just on or off. And so this allows for a quantification of the amount of information contained in a message, or amount of information that can be transmitted across a channel. So this is, we're still talking about this one, this first notion of information. We're going to see the second one in a little bit. Okay, so we can go on to the next couple of paragraphs, because they're shorter ones, I think, or at least one is shorter. Yeah, so I'll read the next bit. In this sense, the information signal is what is not predictable and what sections off the predictable, to the point that the energy that conveys this signal, or the supports that record it, must have states that, compared to the order of magnitude of the information signal, long or wide according to the case, can be considered as predictable, such that the unpredictability of the states of the support or of the modulated energy does not interfere with that of the information signal. If we wanted to transmit a background noise considered as a signal by means of an apparatus that already has a background noise, it would be necessary that the background noise belonging to the system of transmission be extremely slight relative to the background noise to be transmitted as a signal. An area of fine, very flat, and uniformly lit sand is very difficult to photograph. The grain of the photographic film must be much smaller than the average magnitude of the image of grain of sand on the film, or else the granulation of the developed film could equally be due to the image or to the grain of the film. Decision, which is characteristic of the information signal, will no longer exist. One cannot duplicate the image of the grain of a photographic film by means of the same type of film. A more fine-grained film must be used. However, in another sense, information is what implies regularity and periodic occurrence, i.e. predictability. The more easily predictable the signal is, the more easy it is to transmit. Thus, when an oscillator has to be synchronized by means of another oscillator, the more the oscillators are stable on their own, the easier it is to synchronize one of the oscillators by means of the other. Even if the synchronization signal is very weak and almost on the same level as the background noise, it is possible to receive this signal without error by means of the phase comparison apparatus, which supposes that the time during which the receptive oscillator is sensitive to the signal is extremely reduced within the total duration of a period. That is because in this case, the signal is not just emitted or transmitted by the modulation of an energy. It is also received by an apparatus that has its own operation and that must integrate the information signal within its own operation by making it perform the role of effective communication. The information signal is not merely what is to be transmitted without a deterioration caused by the background noise and the other aspects of chance and the degradation of energy. It is also what must be received, i.e. take on a signification and have an effectiveness for an ensemble that has its own operation. Since the problems related to information are problems of transmission in general, the only aspects of information retained and submitted to technological evaluation are those related to the non-degradation of signals during transmission. The problem of the signification of signals is not posed, since the non-degraded signals have upon arrival the signification that they would have had at the point of departure if they had not been transmitted but delivered directly. The human subject is the receiver at the end of the transmission relay, just as it would be if there were no distance separating it from the origin of the signals. In contrast, the problem is quite different when the signals are not simply technologically transmitted but also technologically received, i.e. received by a system endowed with its own operation and which must integrate them into this operation. It is then seen that the physical dimensions relative to the transmission of signals and those relative to their signification are antagonistic. Signals are transmitted better when they merge less with the uniformization of the predictable. But in order for signals to be received and integrated into the operation of a system, they must present an analogy as perfect as possible with those that could be emitted by the receptive apparatus if it were used as an emitter. They must be almost predictable. Two oscillators synchronize more easily when the signals emitted by one and by the other are closer in frequency and in form. Sinusoidal signals, relapse signals, sawtooth waves, pulse train. This possible aspect of reciprocity is illustrated by the coupling of oscillators. When two oscillators allowed to radiate a part of their energy are brought closer to one another, they mutually synchronize in such a way that it can only be said that one guides the other. They no longer form anything but a single oscillating system. In addition to the quantity of information signals transmissible by a given system, one must therefore consider their aptitude for being received by a receptive apparatus. This aptitude cannot be expressed directly in terms of quantity. It is also difficult to call it quality, since quality seems to be an absolute property of a being, whereas here it is a question of a relation. A certain modulated energy can become information signals for a defined system and not for some other system. This aptitude of information, or rather what founds this aptitude, could be called the Hexity of Information. The latter is what makes it such that this is information and received as information, while that is not received as information. The term quality is overly indicative of generic characteristics. That of hexity overly particularizes and shuts into a concrete characteristic what a relational aptitude is. It is only important to indicate that this relational aptitude is attached to the schema of the predictability of information signals. In order for signals to take on a meaning in a system, they must not contribute anything entirely new to it. A set of signals is only significative on a background that almost coincides with it. If signals expose the local reality exactly, they are no longer information but merely an external iteration of an internal reality. If they differ from it too much, they are no longer grasped as having a meaning, are no longer significative, and cannot be integrated. Let's stop there because I think this paragraph goes on for a while. Yes, let me scroll up. Right, so this is the second notion of information, whereas the first one has to do with transmission and what is possible to transmit. The second one has to do with reception and what is possible for something to receive. And so we saw that the first one has to do with the what is unpredictable in a system. So the more something is unpredictable, the more information it transmits. Whereas in the second sense of information, predictability is actually a positive feature, or there's more information for the receptor insofar as it is able to detect something predictable, something regular, rather than something random. And so you can think of, for example, there's the SETI project, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, which looks for signs of extraterrestrial intelligent life in the universe, and one of the things they look for is precisely regularities of signals, so some sort of repeating pattern in a signal. And the idea here is that the reception of some sort of repeating pattern would indicate that it was produced by some sort of intelligent life that was trying to transmit information rather than being produced by some sort of natural phenomenon that is independent of intelligent life, although there are also pulsars which do transmit regular radio waves or regular patterns of radiation, which can be mistaken for signs of intelligent life. Right. So this notion of information as viewed from the side of the receptor has to do with not the quantity of information in the sense that we saw for the first notion of information from the side of the transmitter, but Simondon hesitates here with the terminology, and he says that calling it the quality of information doesn't quite work because quality is an intrinsic something intrinsic about a reality, whereas what he's talking about here is something relational. And then he uses the term hexity, which is a sort of invented term for the thisness of something. But he again thinks that this is not entirely satisfactory because it doesn't really. He says it overly particularizes and shuts into a concrete characteristic what a relational aptitude is. This notion of the qualitative side of the of information, or in another text, in the form information potentials text that we looked at a few months ago, he calls this the tension of information. But this is information as viewed from the side of the receiver, and this notion of information is an information that is greater the more regularity or the more predictability there is in a signal, which is sort of the converse of the first notion. Okay, so I think we can go on to the next page or so of this multi-page paragraph, if someone else would like to read from top of 248, where it says this condition for the reception of information.
So I'll go. Which part exactly? Sorry.
Sorry. Actually, it's a little bit earlier. It's in order to be received. About 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines down. Yeah.
1, 2, 3. 4. Oh, here you are. In order to be received, the signals must encounter the preliminary forms with respect to which they are significative. Signification is relational. This condition for the reception of information signals could be compared to what creates the binocular disparation in depth perception. In order for the relief and the layering of fields in depth to be effectively perceived, it merely requires the image formed on the retina of the left eye to be different from the image formed on the retina of the right eye. If the two images are completely independent, like when we look at one side of the sheet of paper with one eye and the other side with the other eye, no image appears because then there is no point in common. The two images must not be superposable. But their difference must be slight, and they must be able to become superposable by means of a certain number of actions, fractioned on a number of finite planes corresponding to simple laws of transformations. Relief intervenes as a signification of this duality of images. The duality of images is neither felt nor perceived, only the relief is perceived. It is the meaning of the difference of the two givens. In the same way, for a signal to receive a signification not only in a psychological context, but also in an exchange of signals between technical objects, there must be a disparation between a form already contained in the receiver and an information signal provided from the outside. In the disparation is null, the signal corresponds to the form exactly, and the information as a modification of the state of the system is null. On the contrary, the more the disparation increases, the more the information increases, but only up to a certain point. But beyond certain limits, and depending on the characteristics of the receiving system, information becomes null abruptly when the operation through which disparation is assumed qua disparation can no longer be carried out. By increasing the gap between the lenses in a stereoscopic shoot, the impression of relief and the successive staggering of fields are increased. Since the disparation is increased, this apparatus is also used for direct observation at a distance. The sights are produced by means of two periscopes whose lenses can be separated as far apart as desired, which ends up increasing the gap between both eyes. But if the gap between the lenses exceeds a certain limits, which is variable, with the real gap between the first field and the second field, the subject perceives two different images that blur together, with a fleeting dominance sometimes for the left eye, sometimes for the right eye, and an indefinite instability of perception that no longer conveys information as a staggering of the fields and relief of objects. Similarly, a synchronizable oscillator that receives signals strictly of the same frequency as a local oscillation without any phase difference does not receive any signal properly speaking, since there is an absolute coincidence of the local operation and the external operation translated by the signals. If the difference of the frequency increases, information grows due to the effectively integrated signals. But if the received signals have a frequency that is too different from the local frequency, there is no longer any synchronization. Signals are no longer utilized as mediums. Information can be nothing more for the oscillator than what amount to irregular external disturbances, feedback or background noise, the electronic noise of thermal agitation. The condition of frequency is fundamental, but there are other conditions that can be reduced to following. The integration of signals into a functioning system is easier when the distribution of energy is a single period of the signal is more closely related to the distribution of energies, local exchanges. Thus, a relaxation oscillator is more easily synchronized by the step front impulse voltages originating from another relaxation oscillator than by a sinusoidal signal of the same frequency set as impulses. We can call signal that which is transmitted the form that with respect to which the signal is received of the receiver. And information, properly speaking, that which is effectively integrated into the functioning of the receiver. After the experience of disparation involving the exchange signal and the intrinsic form, a recording of information is in fact determination of signals, not a veritable recording of information. The magnetic strip or photographic film records signals as a set of local states, but without an experience of disparation. The magnetic strip of the film that must be used as a secondary source of signals in front of the veritable receiver that will not integrate according to the existence and the existence within of adequate form of the experience of disparation. The magnetic strip must be reactualized as signals, and the photographic film must be exposed to light. The film that modulates the light point by point. In the same way, the photographed objects modulate the film, and the dispersion between the external signals is necessary for perception. The recording must deliver two sets or series of signals separately. It takes two separate photographs to produce a perception of depth, and it takes two tracks on the magnetic strip to produce depth of sound. This necessity to truly separate recordings shows the recording conveys the signals, but not directly integrable information. Dispersion is not made and cannot be made, since it is not on the level of a signal and does not give rise to a signal, but to a signification, which only has meaning in an operation. An operating receiver is required for dispersion to take place. What's needed is a system with structures and potentials. The conditions for the good transmission of signals should no longer be confused with the system's conditions of existence. The signal does not constitute relation.
Right. So here he brings back in this notion of disparation that we've seen throughout this part of the book. And so this is disparation, again, has to do with the difference between retinal images, is the sort of basic notion of disparation, which is borrowed from psychology of perception. And so the difference between the two retinal images is what you use to create or to invent or discover the dimension of depth in visual perception. So Simondon takes this process of invention of depth or discovery of depth as sort of the paradigm for any other process of receiving information in the strong sense. So receiving information in a way that can be used rather than just sort of being bombarded with signals that can't be used. And so this one of the conditions for disparation to be effective, or for there to be this condition of disparation, is that the difference between the two retinal images can't be too great. So if you have some sort of artificial setup in which you transmit one image to one eye and a completely different image to the other eye, then the person doesn't see a combined image with depth. What they see is they see one image and then the other sort of randomly back and forth, or they'll see like some sort of blurred double image or something, but they won't see a combined image in the way that they do in regular depth perception. And so there's a condition of there can't be too great a disparation. The disparation has to be, or disparation as a condition of information reception is always limited in degree. And so the same thing happens when you're transmitting, when you're trying to synchronize a pair of oscillators, for example. If the transmitter oscillator is relatively close in frequency to the receiving oscillator, then they will converge towards a synchronized rate of oscillation. But if the transmitter oscillator is at a very different frequency from the receiver oscillator, then it will no longer, the two will no longer converge towards a synchronized state. And so the information or the signal from the transmitter oscillator will just be a form of background noise that impacts the receiver oscillator, but doesn't actually affect its operation in a straightforward way. So disparation in the proper sense of the term, or is always a sort of intermediate state. So it's there has to be some difference between the state of the receiver and the signal being received. because if there's no difference, then the signal is not transmitting any information at all. But there can't be too much difference, because in that case, the receiver is not capable of actually receiving or using the signal that it receives. So there has to be a sort of intermediate degree of difference between the state of the receiver and the signal that it receives. Right. This line, I think, was a sort of a key one. Oh, actually, I didn't start the screen share, so you can't see which one I'm highlighting. But so the line on page 249, where he gives definitions of a couple of the key terms of this book. So he says, it's about halfway down the page. He says, we can call signal that which is transmitted, form that with respect to which the signal is received in the receiver, and information, properly speaking, that which is effectively integrated into the functioning of the receiver after the experience of disparation involving the extrinsic signal and the intrinsic form. So we have a system in which there's a transmission of information, a transmission of a signal. So the signal is what is transmitted, and then the form is what the aspect of the receiver that permits it to receive information, to receive the signal. And then information in the restricted sense in which Simondon wants to use it is has to do with what can actually be integrated into the functioning of the receiver. So what the receiver is capable of actually absorbing or taking on into its functioning. So this is the more restricted use of the term information that is specific to Simondon. But he does sometimes use the word information in the sense of an information signal. In the more standard information theory sense, rather than here in the specific sense that he wants to use it. But yeah, we should generally think of this definition whenever he uses the term information. This is the first thing that should come to mind.
In relation to this idea that information understood in the receptive sense is related to predictability, and the idea that for signals to take on meaning in a system, as he says on page 248, they must not contribute anything entirely new to it. I guess that this makes me think of Bergson's critique of tracing, and sort of tracing the possible from the actual. And I know that the resolution of two states in disparation for Simondon leads to the creation of a new dimension. But I am a little confused, I guess, as to how we get to the truly new in this notion of information, when the information has to be predictable and can't be entirely new.
Yeah, I'm just trying to find the that passage that you pointed to. You said it's 248, right?
Yeah, the very top of 248.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Yeah, I think for Simondon, when we talk about something new, it can't be new in the sense of completely unprecedented or completely independent from the state of the system before that new element appears. I think if we had novelty in that sense of something completely new, this completely unprecedented or unpredictable occurrence, that would just be randomness. Effectively, it wouldn't be novelty in the more, I guess, concrete sense in which we use the term. So if something completely unpredictable happened, or something that was that was not at all contained in the potentialities of the system before that new element appeared, then that would just be indistinguishable from random happenings that had no sort of structure to them. So insofar as we are capable of creating something new that is receivable, so you can create a new form of poetry, or a new form of music, or I don't know, a new form of scientific discovery or something like that. But those new forms have to be receivable by other people as well. So insofar as you're creating something new that is at the same time receivable, it can't be something so new or so different from what came before that it's completely unprecedented or completely unpredictable. And if it were, then it would just be the same as producing something random, like, I don't know, creating a poem by the Mad Libs method of picking up words out of a hat or something, and just creating a poem at random. So I think novelty in the sense of novelty as something that has a signification, rather than just as something completely new in the sense of not being inherent in what already occurred, has to be a relative novelty, or a novelty that is related to what came before, rather than something that is like completely unprecedented or completely unpredictable, which would just be indistinguishable from randomness.
Thank you. That's helpful. I wonder, I don't know, it does seem like maybe Simondon and Bergson have opposite, or not totally compatible conceptions of the new.
I'm not sure about. I would have to go back to Bergson and look at that that bit about possibility and reality, and whether there's such a thing as possibility before reality. But yeah, I'd have to go back and look at that to be able to say really. So we're coming up to time now, and we're at the end of a subsection. So I would suggest that we end here for today, unless anyone else has any further final thoughts or questions they wanted to bring up before we end. Yeah, so I'm glad everyone showed up today, and thanks for your contributions, and I'll see you next week.